when people have a bad offboarding experience, they will hate you. And if you've built up a good onboarding and usage experience, you've got good brand equity with your customers, why are you going to risk it all in not caring at all about the ending?
Yeah.
And this is down like peak end rule, Daniel Kahneman, 50-50 split between your experience and how you remember it at the end. And that ending is everything.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Joe Macleod was a global head of design for the legendary design agency and game studio UsTwo, and he's a veteran with decades of experience across service, digital, and product sectors. In recent years, he became fascinated with the problem of designing good ending experiences, and he's the founder of what he calls the world's first customer ending business. It's not what you think. No customers get killed in the process. Instead, Joe is focused on giving customers a positive, meaningful, and socially responsible end-of-relationship experience. His book, titled Ends, is a look into the importance of thinking about offboarding, from sustainability and recycling through data and privacy to retiring old products and tools, and finds the roots of our collective repression of the end-of-cycle problem in our fear of death and the rise of mass-market capitalism. In this conversation, we discuss his childhood in the UK, his journey through the world of product development as mobile was dramatically transforming our world, and his insight that so many of our societal problems come from our collective refusal to consider endings. So let's jump right in with Joe Macleod. All right, I'm sitting here across the screen from Joe Macleod. Joe, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And so the first question these days is, how is everything where you are? You're in Stockholm, Sweden, right? So are you locked down? How are things over there?
It's not so bad right now. We're in mid-January in 2021, to give it some context. So Sweden didn't lock down, or didn't appear to lock down like everyone else did at the beginning of the pandemic. A lot of people thought that was down to Swedish sort of not interested in doing it, but actually there's laws in Sweden where you can't tell people to just shutting homes and stuff like that. So actually, based on the good sort of the freedoms and the laws that we have, we've actually not done shutting down. But that doesn't mean that people have not been interested in doing it. We've done social distancing in transport, in restaurants and all sorts of places. And now recently in January 2021, the laws have changed. The government's changed the laws so they can now enforce lockdowns. So we'll see where we're at. We haven't had the UK virus pick up here. We're not having the numbers that we did have. And actually, we have numbers dropping at the moment in Stockholm in intensive care.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Yeah, Sweden, everybody was talking about the Swedish model, and people were in here were looking at the Swedish model and we're constantly comparing. And I think it's very cultural dependent too, right? Because some people, you just say, hey, you should probably not go out, and they stay at home. And then some people, like in Israel, you tell them there's massive fines and the people still go out.
So we're in it's quite a big country. It's an enormous country, and there's only like 8-9 million people in it. We don't have the density of population other countries do in other parts of the world, so it hasn't been intense. And we've got the highest, I think, proportion of people in Europe or the West which have single residents in homes. There's lots of demographic differences between countries, and we forget to add them in a lot of these situations.
Interesting. Yeah, so this is our fourth quarantine now. And the good news is that the vaccines are going really well in Israel. So we're about 20%, even over 20% vaccinated already. And my parents have been vaccinated. So I feel like this is probably the last quarantine, but cross my fingers. We do have the UK strand here, so we'll see where that goes. And you're from the UK, right?
Yeah, we moved over here. My wife's British as well. We've got a couple of kids. One's 15 and one's 12. We moved over here. Originally, my wife had a job at Spotify. It hasn't mattered so much where I work for doing ends because I'd usually jump on a plane and go somewhere to do a talk or a training or meet a client. So I could work from anywhere. So we moved to Stockholm in Sweden and have loved it. We thought we'd move there for a couple of years initially, and we're nearly 5 years here now, and so it's been great, loving it.
Cool. And maybe we'll get to that a little bit. But I like to start these conversations with kind of a look back and try to find a pattern in your kind of journey. And then see if as the journey kind of unfolds, we resonate with what we said in the beginning. And so my question to you in the beginning is, what's something that you've believed since childhood or since an early age? It doesn't have to be a formal belief. It could be just a sense or something you held that still drives you today, something that's still with you today from that early age.
That's an interesting question. So I think I wasn't very well educated as a kid. I grew up in a quite rubbish area of southeast England. Went to a pretty rubbish school. I wasn't academically inspired or inspiring, but I did have something which was I was quite creative. I was quite interested in being creative, and as I grew older, I understood that to be a passion around designing things. The similar sort of time, and earlier, I've often been challenged in school and stuff, and I'm in my late 40s now. I'm actually 49 now. And so when I was a kid, dyslexia wasn't really a thing. You were just told you were stupid or slow. So I grew up with that mindset. So being told that a lot, you have to become quite self-reliant and self-confident in what you think is right. And so I've often had that feeling to try and do something which I believe in and try not to be persuaded otherwise. Got diagnosed with, I thought I had it and I was told I had it, and then I finally got a diagnosis of dyslexia when I was in my early 20s, and it actually really helped me frame my path and where I had come from, I think, and where I felt like I was going. It made me far prouder in myself as an individual, and also gave me confidence to believe in myself, because dyslexics is a very different way of thinking than what we're pushed and told to think in school. So it's not by repetition or rote, it's very much more through logic. I've enjoyed doing that. And I think partly going into design, in fact, you can add up dyslexics in terms of where you'll find them is prison, the highest amount, and then art school. And I think that says ever such a lot about the bias in academia and education. Doing that, and I think you start to see things in a very different upside down world. You get a lot of dyslexics do three-dimensional thinking is really strong with dyslexics. So you get a lot of them doing product design, a lot doing architecture. And I think more recently you get a lot which are falling into the web, because it's a sort of three-dimensional model as people navigate through it and having many different layers operating in different ways. So doing a lot of that type of stuff, and then coming to a point where I was looking at ends and feeling that path out as a place to start investigating. And the amount of pushback I got early on was enormous. Like, why would you want to do this? Well, no one's thinking about this. Nobody needs to think about this. This isn't going to be great for our bottom line, and businesses, You can imagine. So it's the most difficult thing to sell, and it's the most challenging route, and I've been told to avoid it and not go down it, and I just keep going down it. So I guess that's my path, and hopefully my future path as well.
Interesting. And I think what I'm hearing between the lines is this sense of people are going to have their opinions about me, but I'm going to do my own thing. And that's definitely, it seems to be true throughout what you're doing today as well.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing. And I think it's also important for others who feel like that in their growth, their education and their beliefs, is to keep pushing on and persevering with them.
For sure. And so tell me about how you got involved with digital, with computer interaction, because that happened, I think, pretty early on.
Yeah, so I guess going back to 1995, I was at St Martin's Design School in London studying graphics. No one was doing digital as an education then. This was super early web. In fact, we were on 14K modem dial-ups with like black and white images and stuff. Very early HTML. And there were like three of us were quite interested in it at that art college in around 95, 96. And we started to investigate it and start to build these very crude early versions of that. And that gave me quite an interesting appeal about getting into digital web and looking at this sort of, again, going back to three-dimensional models, looking at this system that will be revealed in one place and yet is held in another place. And that was, you don't get that passion now. I remember when I first started doing it and the idea that this digital thing was coming through the telephone line and appearing here and then could appear anywhere else repeatedly. And it was live. And it was such an interesting experience. And designing for that was really interesting. It was a horrible platform to design with. Basically, you only had the different sized fonts. And those were...
You're talking about the old Nokia phones, or what's
this is web. So this is pre times of, and so this is like 96, 90, 95, 96. And then I left there. I'd done sort of rubbish sort of graphics and flyers and stuff. And I was out of school at that point, done all sorts of albums, and I was doing design of albums. I wasn't recording albums, by the way. Yeah, so I was doing club flyers, club posters, all sorts of stuff. And then it got interesting. There was a really early course at the Royal College called Computer-Related Design, run by Gillian Crampton Smith. And it was a super early pioneering course. And we were basically doing interaction design. So I managed to get on that course, and that really changed my life. And that really met some really interesting people on that course that I'm still friends with. And really got to grips with designing for humans in technology. And then after that and I started doing early WAP sites, which were equally awful as early websites.
I remember those.
Yeah.
That's really funny. I can remember I was a tech journalist at the time, and we would go to these conferences and they'll make such a big deal out of it and be like, we have WAP, and then you open it and it's like, what the hell is this? It's just rows of text.
It was interesting because I think we all thought it was going to end up like the Japanese CHTML Docomo stuff that was super rich, and they'd done all sorts of consumer experiences on it, but we got nowhere near that with WAP. It was a shocking underachievement by other countries in terms of building mobile internet experiences.
It's interesting. And so you did get involved with mobile phones, like you worked for Orange and I think Nokia for some time. Is there anything kind of memorable from that time that stayed with you?
Yeah, I left the Royal College after, that was 2000, 99, 2000. Left there and went straight into a .com like agency job, which was at a company called Oyster Partners, which then got acquired, and now it's LBLA Digitas, I think. So we were doing websites, loads of websites, making loads of money, and also not really thinking about the wider business. We were a lot of young people not really thinking about a 10, 20-year trajectory of building a business around it. So I think we fleeced a lot of companies back then. And then the .com crash, the first one happened like end of 2000. And that was, I moved quite quickly actually over to mobile, because I'd done a lot of work in mobile in my course, and I was quite interested in mobile, far more so than I really was in web. And then moved over to mobile and started doing stuff for Orange and doing a lot of service design, concept stuff with some teams there. And that was great. And that was a great time for mobile and Orange in particular. A lot of really interesting stuff was happening about location-based stuff. We'd done stacks of things around that sort of thing. And then I left doing that and I moved over into Nokia and started at Nokia, goodness, I can't remember now, maybe 2005, and moved, was there for about 6 years. And that's the time where Nokia had made the most amount of money they'd ever made. They had a dominance, a market dominance, which Apple hasn't really got to, which was well over 50% of the market in mobile, and no one was near them. And we got to a point where we were doing ever so well. And within a few years, we were doing ever so badly. And that was chipping away at other companies chipping away at us. But also it was, I think, an arrogance with Nokia that they believed that they didn't need to compete on the same level. So they didn't really take up the challenge of Apple's iPhone at the time, which was super fractional niche product, but also BlackBerry, and there's a couple of Motorola products back then, which was maybe the Razr, which almost alone took about 10%, 20% of Nokia's market share, a wildly successful product. And so I experienced one of the biggest downturns in the company. So as I was leaving, it was on a good trajectory downwards. So it was super fascinating to see enormous success, enormous failure of a company. And it did make you realize that it doesn't matter how big you are, you have a capability to fail. So I often think of that when people bang on about how great Apple is or other companies we see.
Yeah, and the funny thing with Apple is I keep predicting that it's over, but I think they have enough good designers and good people to carry on for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe Facebook's a better example, where I think you can have a few bad years and bad PR, and your product could be quite quickly changed around. And I agree. I just think it's interesting, the Nokia story. Yeah, so I was there for about 6-7 years, and then I went to a smaller company called UsTwo.
Yeah, UsTwo is a legendary design agency. I've been following them for years, and they have these amazing games now. Like, I remember playing Monument Valley. It's such a gorgeous game. They kind of one of the first companies to bring like mobile games to like an art form, and now they have this adventure thing, like a venture builder arm. I don't know if any of that was stewing when you were there. What was that like?
It was great moving from a massive company where you needed to do loads of PowerPoint planning and telling people you wanted to do something, and then going to a small company which had a lot of self-belief. It also had the ability to build stuff. So there really was like a half-half split between building and so tech and design and other components. So we could really do stuff. And the attitude I'd experienced at Nokia, which was very slow, to move into UsTwo, to hear it go, yeah, do you want to do this? Just do it. Let's get on and do it. And that was super exciting. I was there, I think, about 6-7 years. And in that time, I think I got there and I was probably about 60 people. And when I left, there was 250 people. And I'd seen far bigger growth in the .com times. When I was at Oyster, we went from 70 to 250 in a year. And that really, if you want to kill a culture, grow that quickly. But UsTwo, it was good. And I really enjoyed it. Mills and Sinks were great sort of mentors and colleagues, and built the design team up from, I guess it was about 30 when I got there, to it was about 100 when I left. And we were over 4 sites: New York, Malmo in southern Sweden, and London, and Australia. And that was really fantastic. We'd done all sorts of company products. We had big clients like Barclays, H&M, and done really good work for them. We always done mobile first. And we had this sort of sideline, which we got to grips with and understood a lot more as we grew. So this was a sort of innovation arm, you could call it, in a crude sense, early on. And out of that, sometimes we'd do a short app project, or like we'll do a game. And we were quite ignorant of what really we were doing. And then we heavily invested in a project called Whale Trail, which was a really early game that they'd done. I don't know if you've seen that one. It had a quite compelling sort of game mechanism, and we'd done a really good job and put a lot of effort into it. And it came out, and it couldn't have been a better launch. We had all of the carousels on all of the global sites for Apple. We got great press coverage. It was amazing, and we got into the top 10 of Apple product on the App Store, I think, for maybe a few days, and then it just went down. And it gave us an impression of actually we need to invest properly in this and get the right type of team in. And then we got a games artist in, games producers in, game developers in. We properly invested in it. And then another year, maybe not a year, but like we started to work onto Monument Valley, and we found this as we go through a number of different iterations between what products we want and projects we wanted to do, and games in particular. And then we would pick one and then start deep diving into that and iterating and building and iterating and building. And Monument Valley took a year or so to build, and it was very well crafted, beautiful and it was a very different angle to what everyone else was doing at the time. We wanted to show a really beautiful product that people would be passionate about spending money on immediately, instead of in-game purchase that we'd have to build some sort of like guilt logic into. So we built that, launched that, and it was super successful, and we learned a lot from that. And I think really crudely, I think it probably cost us 800,000 to invest in over a year, 18 months. And then we made a good few million out of it, maybe 7 million in a couple of years. And I think it's probably up to 10 million, 12, 15 million now.
And
I think they relaunched it, repackaged it. Yeah. And then like when you've got some good product in your hands, you can then do deals in China and stuff like that. So it's massive, and it's a great income for them.
That's great. And it has integrity that most mobile games that I know don't really have, where it's all about the ads or getting you to spend money in in-app purchases. It doesn't feel like it's not about the experience. And this is a game where it just feels like it's an artistic creation. It's a vision that someone has and wants to share it with you. And
Absolutely.
You can go in and have experiences inside. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that comes through to the artistry of it as well. From top to bottom, it's about honest, beautiful craft and a really wholesome old school type puzzle game for Monument Valley, at least. And I think that comes across in a lot of their subsequent work, where they've looked at authentic problem space, which could have been a puzzle from the last 100 years, and then really crafted that into a beautiful digital experience. And that's, and I think people really respond to that. There's a massive audience for that type of game out there, which isn't shoot 'em up, killing people. And you don't see a lot of that either in a lot of the UsTwo games. Is like decapitating or shooting somebody up close or something like that. It's all about puzzles, getting one place to another, finding something, doing something.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Any other stories you can share with us, because many of the people who are listening are designers? So any insights from that time at UsTwo about the craft of designing products or building things?
I think we had a really good place to have good team discussions. I've had teams before in the past, but they've often fell into silos, but you'd get a real bonding at UsTwo on many levels. So it never felt like we were going to do this as a design team and then hand it over to development. We'd all be in the same room, the same time, doing the same activities. So we'd be going through the same processes, having equal say on different things. And that was, I think, a really important thing that we took away from that. We were also very free and open about applications and the tools we used. So I know a lot of companies which would be really rigid about, like, we've got to use Adobe products or we've got to use Microsoft products. And this was, it wasn't that long ago that nobody was making other sort of tools for companies. And we were quite early on into sort of experience and being customers for these tools. So it was quite difficult to, when I think back, we started using Dropbox early on. And other sort of like collaborative tools for running sprints and stuff. These were really early tools, but you try to go to a big company and talk to their tech team, their security team about using Dropbox or something like that. It was really challenging. And we always had this open attitude towards that. And I think with that, we learned a lot about tools more generally in terms of digital tools, using these tools, and also helped us to design those tools. And I remember chatting to people at other companies who've been locked into certain tools that they were using, and it really held them back a lot of the time.
Yeah, resonate with that quite a bit. I was head of product at an agency in New York, and my philosophy was like, if a tool works better for you, just use it and don't even look at the price. It doesn't matter. And I got some pushback, And then we did like a financial analysis, and we found that the sum total of all the software tools we use, no matter what we paid for them, amounted to 1% of our expenses. And I can tell you, when you find a tool that works better, it's way more than 1% increase in output or quality of work and, all that stuff. When a team actually gels around an organizational tool, you can't calculate. That's like orders of magnitude better outcomes.
I think also to think about that, not just digital tools, but team management tools and processes that you might use. So like retrospectives, I think those were some of the most useful tools to use. And we were also quite open to those type of tools coming in. When I think back on how rigid it was before maybe 2010 probably 2010 is a good line in the sand to draw. We've had some incredible sort of leaps in terms of processes and team working and stuff like that. And since then, it's been quite impressive.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned Adobe, and that actually is a great segue. So a couple of weeks ago, a dialog pops up on my laptop. It says, "Thank you for using Adobe Flash Player. We're going to stop supporting it by December 31st. We recommend you hit uninstall now." And so I hit uninstall, and then it showed me another screen. It uninstalled, and then it said, "Thank you for using Adobe Flash Player. We're proud that Flash had a key role in evolving web content across animation, interactivity, and video, and we're excited to help lead the next era of digital experiences." And then poof, Flash was gone from my life. Up until that moment, there were times where it was everywhere, and many times where it crashed things. And this is at least some attempt to create an end for a product, and it's the first time I saw it. When I saw it, I was like, huh. It was like, I don't ever remember a product like saying, "Hi, let me uninstall myself."
I think it's
so
fascinating.
In that sense,
and going back to what we were really talking about earlier about this time period between, one of the reasons I went to the Royal College was because somebody built something in Flash then, and I was really inspired by that thing they created. And to think that you had this type of power, because really it was super pioneering at the time. You couldn't do anything nearly that with other tools. And so a lot of us have grown up using Flash for all sorts of things on the web. And in, I guess, the last 10 years as well, it's really not been very good in comparison. They haven't really moved on with it. And now we come to the end of Flash. And I think it's been interesting observing it because it's been such a technically driven ending. It has been dry, it's been emotionless, and it's been barely informative. It's come up as a pop-up, as an alert, as something that might come up as some sort of other thing that's broken on your computer. And it seems a really missed opportunity. And this is not uncommon. All companies do it. The amount of human nostalgia that you and I, sitting here talking about this, working in this field, and all of the listeners have for Flash is gigantic. And the amount of probably goodwill we could have had over the last 10 years as that's declined to have a better, more emotional, meaningful offboarding experience as a group and do it collaboratively maybe with Adobe. And they can phase that out over that period. Instead, what we've got is they've just picked up their coat and walked out. And everyone else has been telling us that product won't work on their systems anymore.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. If you can imagine if they did something like send us your best memories of Flash, or and they featured that as the offboarding experience, or key moment in the web, like the first web video was Flash, right? The first so many things, but still it was, at least it didn't just linger and die. Like at least someone made a choice to, we're going to uninstall this from people's machines. And
I think absolutely that the opportunities, and this is advice for all businesses, your product's going to die one day. Plan it, schedule it, and work with the people who use it. And then you go through little steps and you all know where you're going. And I think Flash has probably been dying for 10 years. There hasn't been a coherent plan about it. In fact, there's a really crude animation tool on the Adobe Cloud thing called Animate, which is basically essentially Flash, and it's atrocious. And I think Adobe's a perfect example of this problem. They don't know how to end things at all. The burden I have going into Illustrator or Photoshop or any Adobe product now, which obviously is built by a siloed team, which is probably right next to the Illustrator team or the InDesign team. They've got minute differences between features in products that could be aligned, but I'm sure it's too late now because the products are so overwhelming. And I think it's a really good example. You see this, and it doesn't get revealed so much in other businesses, but there's a very similar common element in other businesses with billing models. You'll get big telecom companies all over the world who have been giving out promotional type deals. So you'll get My Close Friends or something like that, and it's a tiny fraction cheaper. But they done that in the sort of mid-90s, and no one has been able to kill that now, and they've got probably 50 or 100 people out of their 2 million database of customers, for example. They don't know how to kill it, but they have to honor it in their billing model, in the back-end infrastructure, and in not allowing people to leave it. So you have this inability to end revealed in software products, in billing features, in telephone systems, for example, and all over the place. We've got the similar thing is in a consumer sense, in a personal experience, you have a similar experience with us hoarding loads of things. So people buying off-site storage. I don't know how to end this, so I'm going to buy more space to just keep it. And this goes on in all of these places, and the same problem is the lack of an ability to have an ending.
Yeah, and the thing that comes to mind now is, as it's in the news, is the inability of a president to let go of power. I don't think there was any plan there to leave the White House ever. It was just to get in. But let's not get too much into that. So I'd love to hear how you first got interested, the story of how you first got interested in endings, and what drew you to that.
So a couple of experiences did way back in, I guess, to early 2000s. And I was teaching at the time, just doing half the day at, I think, Central St. Martin's in London, and teaching a design course. And I set a project which was about rubbish or waste. And so everyone went off and for a couple of weeks done these projects, and we all came back, and everyone had created essentially more waste, promotional things about looking after things. Don't waste things written on a pencil or a mug, or don't do this, and it's written on this thing, or a t-shirt which says don't waste stuff. And at the same time, what actually I took away from that is that we did the most genius thing to have done for that brief. The best, most philosophically correct answer would have been not to have created anything, and say to everyone, I took a different approach and I decided not to create something. And to do that and to say that to a design group would be like heresy. However, I didn't understand what was going on. I just thought, like, this didn't really work out, did it? So I needed to build up that vocabulary as well. And I had a similar experience, as a personal experience, on a voice recognition system called Wildfire, which was on Orange in the early 2000s. And it was meant to take your voice calls and look after your messages, almost like a personal assistant type thing. And I would have to then ring into Wildfire and say, hey, Wildfire, play me my messages. And Wildfire would come back and say, sorry, I don't understand you. And at that point, it would keep saying, sorry, I don't understand you. And it was really angering. And I felt the onboarding experience was sold to me as this emotional belief in this technology, and it was going to make this situation so much better. And I was emotionally engaged with that, and I felt like it was going to be incredible, and it so wasn't. And I wanted to end it. I didn't want to just end it. I was so angry with it. I didn't want to just end it by stop paying anymore and saying I want to stop this service. I wanted to get physical with it and have a emotional ending with it. But again, I didn't have the vocabulary. And these two experiences were happening at the same time, the wildfire thing and the teaching and the brief about rubbish. And I realized at that point, there wasn't this vocabulary about what I didn't understand. I didn't even understand what I was grappling at. But there was something about endings which we hadn't really grappled with and we didn't have a vocabulary for. And so I'd done a short project way back then, and I actually I'd done it for Orange to talk about closure experiences, is how I defined it early on. And closure experiences wasn't a very deep project. It was only 4 or 5 weeks, but that started the journey that I went on thereafter. And then I also went off and done my career. So endings, and I called it closure experiences early on, was in the background going on, and until after I left UsTwo, and then I felt I have to really investigate this. This is so important, and I couldn't leave it any longer. So I decided, in fact, it was a big life change for us as a family as well. My wife wanted to get back to work. I wanted to investigate endings, and also wanted to hang out more with my kids. I was working really mad hours and was missing out on experiencing being a parent. So I swapped my life around and started looking into endings. And the beginning of that started with death. Because I had to go far deeper into the issue as a human experience, as an experience that went back on a journey before the Industrial Revolution, and something that was bigger, more profound, more sociologically established, instead of the personal sort of consumer experience we have today. And I am really pleased I went back that far, because it gave me such a better view of the problem that we have now. Now, when I see people talking about sustainability, talking about privacy in digital or something like that, we talk about that in the microseconds that we've lived on in our own life and in our own digital lives and our own consumer lives. And actually, the problem goes way deeper. It's a sociological problem, and it has a lot to do with how the Industrial Revolution was framed, how we grew the Industrial Revolution from a story onboarding mechanism, and we forgot over that period of time how important offboarding was as a consumer experience. And these things were undone over years for the benefit of what we'd say big business. But I don't really like to frame it as a big business society issue, because actually I haven't met any big businesses that think about how great it was back in the olden days before the Industrial Revolution, before the Protestants. They aren't thinking in those terms either. So it's important that we frame it in terms that are sociologically driven from a historical perspective, and stop talking about things like plastics in the sea. It's the wrong type of conversation to have for a problem that isn't just physical. It goes across digital, service, and physical sectors. And it's about the consumer life cycle being biased.
Yeah. So coming at it from a Buddhist perspective, there's this core principle. It's one of the 3 marks of existence in Buddhism, anicca, which is impermanence. And when you unpack that, the Buddha says everything that arises subsides. Anything that is subject to birth is subject to death. And yeah, in Western societies, it's for some reason, it's something that we started to hide and run away from. Do you have an insight into how that process happened? Because in some Buddhist societies, there's still monks that are encouraged to go and sit next to a dying man and sit in a cemetery and watch the ashes burn as part of their spiritual growth. But in the West, it seems to have gone away.
Absolutely. So again, I think it's so important to take this back into a historical perspective. We had a good relationship with endings as a human experience previous to the plague and the Protestant uprising. And I start the story for the ends in Europe. I do that because I see the thread of the plague, the Protestant uprising, the changes that the Protestant mindset done to our lives as individuals and our ability to purchase, invest, our lives as individuals in terms of our career path, and the jobs that we could have which are God-given jobs instead of God only gives out these type of jobs. Meaning that you can do any job in the eyes of God and it be a good job. And that's a big change to career paths. And fasting as well. The importance of fasting, and I think more so now, the opportunity for a culture, a community to withdraw themselves from the abundance of life and to then reflect upon how lucky they are. I think it's one of the most, the biggest losses that we've had for all sorts of reasons is that skill set. And we're seeing it now. I think it's an interesting parallel to make actually with lockdown. We are getting told to withdraw from the freedoms that we've had in our lives, and we are super reflecting about how much we miss it. And if you've got that skill and that mechanism, I think you can have a far more profound relationship with consumerism, with abundance, and be healthier about that conversation with yourself and with others.
This chance to reflect, if we pause on that for a second, I think, first of all, a lot of people who reflect also find that they don't miss consumerism that much.
Absolutely,
that they don't miss going to the office so much.
No.
And so I think there's a story you told that made reflection real to me, which is the end of treatment bell. I love that story, and also it shows how important that process is of stopping and acknowledging. Do you want to tell the story?
So certainly I'd love to. So the end of treatment bell I first heard about was from the UK, but they really originated in America, I think. There was this young girl I heard about in the UK. She had cancer and she needed to get some treatment done in the US. She went to the US and she was sitting there in this children's ward in the US. And you can imagine how weird this is for a kid anyway, and how uncomfortable it must be being in a foreign place thinking about this sort of stuff. And amongst all of this, she watched these kids get up and walk to the end of the ward, the children's ward, and ring this massive brass bell, which makes a really deafening sound, and it's really impactful for everyone's experience in that ward. And so she asked the doctors and nurses what that was, and they said it was an end of treatment bell. When the children have finished their treatment, they can ring this bell and it shouts out that you've finished and it's a conclusion. And so she thought it was a brilliant idea. She took the idea back to the UK and she told the doctors and nurses in her ward in the UK about it. They installed an end of treatment bell in that hospital. Emma was the first person to ring it after she'd finished her treatment, and it brings a context and a closure to the experience of treatment in healthcare, particularly for kids, which I think it is far more powerful for. But we could all do with that. I think one of the biggest difficulties in a lot of healthcare is that at the end of treatment, you don't get a fanfare. There isn't any balloons and pats on the back. You're often delivered that good or bad news by exactly the same person who told you had the problem in the first place. It'll be in the same room. It'll be in the same cold method. Yeah. And so there isn't this closure and this emotional gravity to the situation, which the end of treatment bell does. And in fact, they've rolled them out across the UK now. So there's end of treatment bells in hospitals up and down the country. And there's a charity that puts them in. And you can go to the charity page on Facebook and check out all these little kids ringing this bell. And it's really eye-watering. You should go and check it out. It makes you appreciate stuff. Coming back to reflection.
And I've experienced this in my life enough to know we often end something without acknowledging the moment. And then it lingers and it festers, and there's something unsatisfying and unsatisfied that stays within you. And I've learned that when I finished my undergrad degree, I didn't really celebrate. I didn't do anything. I was just so busy with the next step. And it took me months to realize that there was something missing. And so now I'm actually finishing a master's degree. I bought a bottle of whiskey. I don't even know what I'm going to do, but I bought a bottle of whiskey and some tumblers, and I'll find a way to mark that when the final grade comes in. I'll find a way to mark it.
It's so important. All big endings of transition points in human life are a celebration. Humans come together, they celebrate something in a time-honored way, so it will be over a certain period, usually a day. But if you go through all sorts of religious practices, there'll be a period of time, humans come together, they go through a sequence of things that bring conclusion to a transition. So that conclusion to a single life is marriage. That conclusion to a divorce, for example, could be celebrated. A lot of people don't. They think it's thing, but that's wrapped up in other parts of divorce. But life itself and funerals are often a celebration in many cultures. And I think, again, coming back to the pandemic that's on at the moment, the lack of celebrations in that mechanism for students who've graduated that are doing this all remotely, just the end of projects for those students. And also, I think the amount of people who've died in this and their families can't have any meaningful ending to that, and they can't bury them in a meaningful way or cremate them in a meaningful way. And there's such a lot endings in the more bigger, wider human experience, beyond sort of what I'm with consumer experiences, but the rhetoric and the issues, the emotional triggers are very similar.
Yeah. I really hope when this is over, they'll find a way to celebrate it and mark it and honor the people who are not with us.
Yes.
Yes. So you write a lot about the history of this and the process. And so we talked a little bit about the Protestant transition and how did this actually start that we moved so far away from these endings?
So picking up again from a European perspective in the Protestant uprising. So after the plague, new challenger religion comes along with these different ideals. Those things like fasting, different types of jobs, invest, all sort of lay the foundations for industrial revolution. And previous to this, our experience as consumers has been very raw. It's been very visible. I could action it as a consumer in pre-industrial times. I could mend stuff. I could change the dimensions of it, move it from place to place. I could name it, all sorts of these things, which are super important to have ownership, emotional ownership over things. Then the Industrial Revolution comes along. We start manufacturing products at scale. To fulfill those factories that we need to sell more stuff, so we create these story roles, which is marketing. And we tell profound, meaningful stories to humans at the beginning of the consumer life cycle, so they will commit to that consumer engagement. But at the end of that consumer life cycle, we start to fade in interest, fade in things, and they start to get withdrawn. So a really good example of that is a person in what they were called rag and bone men in the UK. Present in all cultures, there'll be a person that goes around a community and asks people to bring out things like metal, paper, rags, and these would be collected, and that person would be given the money for an exchange of like that metal or ash. All sorts of things were collected. And this was very important because it gave the consumer a moment to reflect about the value of that thing, to feel actionable in that exchange at the end of that life. So when the rag and bone man, for example, came around, you would be like, I've got this amount of metal. You go, well, that's worth this. And they'll give you some money. There'll be this transactional exchange, which was a great balancing point for the transactional exchange that went on at the beginning. So you have this onboarding, offboarding balance. These start to, the ability of the rag and bone man and whatever it was called in other cultures was really removed from an industrial perspective. So the metal stopped getting collected by the rag and bone man because the metal industry would source it from other places in bigger quantities. The same with the bones that they used to collect bones as well. Instead of collecting bones of people to make into glue and stuff, they would collect them from abattoirs, industrial abattoirs. So each of these offboarding experiences started to be removed over a century. And we went from the beginning of the century to having this rich sort of offboarding experience that people had an involvement with. It was actionable, it was understandable, and there was a circle of it to right at the end where we have no idea what a different type of plastic is, and to this very challenging environment as a consumer to like, what do I do with this? And it's incredibly complicated components, etc., to the point where everyone goes, oh, I don't know what to do with this. And they'll open up the nearest drawer and chuck it in, whether that be a mobile phone, a laptop, or a pen. In fact, I've been having a real sort of anger with pen. I'm holding up a pen at the moment thinking how angry I am at it. These are terrible items, really. You've got an item that you'll buy. It is incredibly complicated. It's all made of plastic and metals and different types of each one of those. And it usually runs out really quickly. One of the complexity, when we think about plastic bags, for example, plastic bags are a very simple plastic made of one type of plastic. So that's one-dimensional. And we've been talking about plastic bag for like 20 years, about how bad plastic bags are. And if we think about the cycle of simplistic object made of one material to leapfrogging into the next one, maybe some object that's made of two materials, it's going to take us nearly a century to get to a pen component which has like 5 to 6 elements in it. And I think the pace of our intellect around the end and the offboarding is atrociously slow when we think about, we keep repeatedly going on about plastic bags. Why aren't we having a really bad, we can have such a fit when we get to pens in about a century of like, isn't a pen terrible?
That's funny. Well, I buy a pen with, you can buy fillers, but even those are metal containers with plastics on them. And this is a good time to actually ask. So maybe, and I know you've heard this question before, but maybe the reason that people don't address the end is because there's no money in it. And if I can imagine someone who's a little bit cynical or very practical business person or designer, and he's listening to you talk and he rolls his eyes and he was like, I have only so much time. I need to spend it on things that actually support my company and my fellow coworkers. And why should they care?
That comes up so often. It's the most common of questions I get. And it's really important to unravel it a bit. So for one level, as I was saying earlier, businesses are in the same place that we all are. We are thinking about the present and we aren't thinking about how to change that in a sort of sociological state. And admittedly, when I first started digging into this, I thought it was the result of some sort of hard-nosed business logic. And it really isn't. I think we do ourselves a disservice thinking so shallowly about it. There is a wealth of richness that we can all gain out of doing better endings. And they go from sustainability, they go from better sales, better relationships with your customers, highest customer satisfaction rates. They go preempting legislation. So there's stacks of legislation that's come in and really crippled a lot of businesses and of like just not expecting that to happen. And there's all of those type of things going on. But one of the things which I find surprising is how we do need to grapple with it, yet we care so little about it. And I think there's a level of consumer understanding that's fairly unknown. And I'll give you an example with cookies, which you'll get on any website. If you dig into the cookies on a website, now through GDPR and also the California Consumer Privacy Act, and Japan has a similar one, they'll also tell you what the cookie is, who it's from, and give you an expiry date. Essentially in the ending to that cookie.
Right.
Now, when you look at the expiry date of those cookies, they really don't make any sense. Although this is a legal requirement, companies put in, so you can have an expiry date of that session, which is immediately, essentially, once you leave the website, or you can have an expiry date of any amount of time thereafter. In legal terms, we've put this expiry date in there. And I'll just read out some of those from a sort of your average. So I went to an average some tech sort of reviews website, and there's some in there for Amazon. You know, I'm pleased I'm using Amazon. It's super useful for me on such and such a level. How long do you think a fair expiry date? Well, on this thing, it was an expiry date of 5,758 days. That's 15 years. Which you think, man, damn, that's a long time, really. I can't imagine anything I buy off Amazon even lasting 15 years. So, okay, let's move that up a gear. So there's other ones on there. There's a company called Acurity, and they do 24,837 days. That's 68 years on an expiry date for a cookie.
Wow.
That's potential. That's basically a lifespan. As soon as I could probably get onto the web, maybe let's say 10 years old, and I'm actively using like I don't know a tech review site, and I'm getting to a 68-year. But that's not the half of it. So ADT sessions, 36,525 days. That's 100 years. Very few people live 100 years. But then when you get into other ones, then it goes really crazy. Home Depot got 1,642 years. If I went back 1,642 years, I could be a Roman or something like that, given an expiry date or agreeing to a cookie in late Roman Empire times to then it being expiring now. However, the best one is one which is 2,914,550 days. That equates to 7,979 years. That's 8,000 years, basically. So we're looking at the year 10,000, this cookie expires. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up was just how little we really think about the end in any sort of reasonable sense. I think anyone putting that into an expiry date have lost their mind. So it's not a matter of what I end up saying after I've done all of the argumentation is that endings happen everywhere, whether that happens in 8,000 years or next year or 2 weeks' time. It's going to happen. And as we've seen with Flash, you can either make a massive pig's ear of it and it drag out and everyone is reminded about how bad Flash was, or you could plan it, build up some sort of experience, an offboarding experience with different stages, and you could have a collaborative sort of celebratory ending.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I do think from my own experience, there's nothing I hate more than a intentionally difficult offboarding in a service. And that makes me, because when it's easy to get off, then it's easy to get on. It's like, okay, I'll get on. And then if I ever want to, I'll get off again. And it's hard. And you know now that it's hard because you tried to do it once. I would never do this again if I can avoid it.
Absolutely. So Harry Bignell, who done Dark Patterns, he coined the phrase dark patterns. He talks about the sort of Hotel California. Once you go in, you can't get out. How many people and companies I come up against who talk about, well, if it's easy to leave, then more people would leave. Actually, that is such an awful expression because, for one thing, you're devaluing something that's inevitable. You are going to risk your brand equity. When people have a bad offboarding experience, they will hate you. And if you've built up a good onboarding and usage experience, you've got good brand equity with your customers, why are you going to risk it all in not caring at all about the ending?
Yeah.
And this is down like peak end rule, Daniel Kahneman, 50-50 split between your experience and how you remember it at the end. And that ending is everything. You can go out having a fantastic celebratory ending with lots of reflection, positive feeling, and good promotional opportunities, or you can go out with people hating you and giving you bad reviews.
Yeah. And you mentioned in one of your talks that something that really made sense to me is the end of a book or the end of a movie define often the meaning of the whole experience, right? It's how you make sense of it.
Absolutely. And imagine all of your favorite films or books that had like the last sort of 10 minutes left out, and there'd be such, and it is how we've been programmed for thousands of years to experience the world in those terms. If it isn't experienced in the first person by ourselves, then we are experiencing it as a narrative structure. And if most of those narrative structures in our common everyday life now are consumer experiences, and if you're missing out that ending, that last moment, that reflection bit, the bit where it all comes together and you get closure out of that, then you've lost such a lot of really rich, meaningful brand equity.
So tell me about the book. What brought you to write it? What was the experience of writing it, and what was the impact? What was the feedback?
So going back to when I left UsTwo, I thought I'm going to investigate this endings thing, or closure experiences is what I was calling it back then. Well, I started digging into it, and I started digging into it. And I thought initially that it would be like a Medium article, and I'd do a conference talk about it. But actually, I felt very quickly, I started writing some bits about it. I started to unravel everything. And I've never, going back to, I'm dyslexic, it is not an attractive option for me to write a book. No, I've never before that point said, oh, I'd love to write a book. That was never me. I found it very challenging. But, and you'll hear this a lot from authors, they have to tell the story and they have to write the book. And that was a feeling from me, is that it wasn't really an option. I had to put this message, this story, this piece of knowledge all together in some sort of more permanent format than a little article or a conference talk. So I really wanted to write a book, and it also gave me the opportunity to really dig into it in a far deeper, richer way. And that's where I felt like I got the most out of it and could frame it in a far more appropriate, and I believe the right way, which is a historical, sociological construct that we have forgotten about in our present consumer mindsets.
Yeah.
So it took me a couple of years to write the book. Then I looked into all sorts of different options around publishing, but ended up doing self-publishing. I mean, I could have written, I went to a few publishers and I could have written no end of like design thinking books or any other type of trend. But going to publishers saying I want to write a book about endings and offboarding experiences, there was like, yeah, well, see you later, or just no return. So that was interesting. And I think it's important because it's a reference point for me now to build on the other stuff. So that says, and it provides me with a context of how to build everything else out on the ends theme, because it gives me a point of view that I can keep referencing back to. And the next book that hopefully coming out this year will be about how to design endings.
So that would be about the more practical kind of detailed models of how to do it.
Yeah, exactly. So the first book was why we don't, and the next book will be how to, really. And then my intention is after that to do sector specific ones. So I've already got one lined up about data, to doing ends in data, which I'm gonna, in the follow-up ones, I'm going to partner with some people. So I've already started working with a couple of people around ends and data.
Wonderful. So we'll get to that in a second. I will just say about the book that's out, the first book. It definitely, first of all, it's very moving to me because I'm a designer who is hoping to write a book. And it's very, you can tell that the writer is a designer because it's all about paying attention and noticing things in the world and asking tough questions and saying like, this doesn't make sense, or there's a better way to do it. All are traits that I know from my designer friends. And it does feel like it's a big opening towards something. So it feels like the second book is almost like part two. And now, okay, you convinced us, let's get this done.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. So I've been sort of like put the other part of this story together, because framing it doesn't mean that you realize how to do it. And it took me a while to synthesize how I think we can get through this, the tools, the mechanisms that we need to start adapting to. Because when doing the first book, it's sort of like you just end up with massive like, okay, now I know the problem. And you probably feel like that. Any designer listening in is sometimes a long path between understanding what the problem is and working out how to solve it.
For sure. But it's an important step. It's a very important step, but that's
exactly.
not
it's a critical step. Exactly.
So is there anyone who does ending, either in business or some other place, does the ending really well, that where you like, this is how we should all think about this?
Of course, there's loads of companies that do really good endings. I don't think they frame them in the same way that I would, but by, was it hook or crook, they end up doing what I think is a good ending. One of the companies which I think do it best, though, is Pant Collection, which is the plastic collection that you get in a lot of countries. So it's quite common in Northern Europe. So what happens is that when you buy a bottle of Coke or lemonade or a can, there'll be this little sign on the back and it will say PANT. And what it will mean is that there's a whole sequence of things in the back end. But you pay a little bit of money at purchase. It's about 10 10 pence, for example, or something. So you put a small deposit down at purchase. You then go away and consume the product, and then you're left with the residue of that product, which is the bottle or the can or something. And then you can take that to the supermarket, and you'll put that product into that machine, the right machine. So it will then take it, analyze it, and then crush it, and then it will go off to be processed. Now, and then you'll get that money back. So what's great about this system is that it thinks about the whole life cycle, end to end. So it's beginning to end, rather. So at the beginning, you have engagement. You have a commitment by the consumer to take on the responsibility of this item. So that's through the deposit and a small amount of temporary debt. Over a period of time, you then take it then back to, you're encouraged to take this item back. You've got a drawer to take it back, and it's actionable on the consumer to take the responsibility for this thing, which is, I think, very key to having better ending experiences, that the consumer gets involved with clear knowledge of what's going on, because there's so many bad endings, flippant endings, which happen too fast with ignorance. And then that item's crushed. And in the back end, there's a transaction model system. But equally important and vital, arguably, is that the country can then have leverage over anyone introducing the product into that country in terms of what the plastic is they use, or the aluminium that they use. So they will then have an ability to give leverage over certain types of plastic being used and minimize that. Because if you know anything about recycling, bad plastic going in with good plastic will ruin all the plastic, for example. So Norway, for example, have got their recycling of plastics down to like 98% quality now because of this system. And the consumers are engaged in the system, and there's a whole systems around that. So this is a fantastic ending in my mind, because the whole engagement thing is all built out through that system and that relationship.
Cool.
But other companies do it equally. You can look at Netflix and their easy come and go onboarding, offboarding experiences. So they're very encouraging about people leaving their company and making it easy. There's not a lot of companies that make it easy to leave, but Netflix are quite happy to do that. Although they do keep all your data, so it's more like pausing your account. But the experience is there and the discussion's there, and that's really important.
That's the one company that I've been paying continuously for the past, 15 years. I was a subscriber since they sent discs in the mail in the US.
Well, you can leave them quite easily and then
really
come back to them, and they just they cache your account. They just pause it on many events. Cool. And then you can look at physical product companies. Like I think Kaya Cars is a really good example with a 7-year warranty. That helps the consumer have this visibility, this relationship into the future. 7 years is, and I think you've heard me say this before, 7 years is a little bit further than most humans can think. So it becomes sort of like void, this death-like void, which you sort of think like the funeral of the product. And so there's this clear ending. And that's been incredibly successful for Kaya Cars. So there's a load of different companies and that have done it really well, and framing that, understanding that, and designing for that is what I'm trying to help people think about and build tools around, and encourage us all to create better endings.
Cool.
And there's a stack of companies that do it terribly as well, obviously.
Yeah. Like probably most companies. Yeah, I would love to hear anything from the second book, if you want to give us a more of a teaser about what's inside. I know you touch on data, and I think that's all really interesting.
Yeah, that would be great. Let me tell you a bit about the next. I think I'm going to call it engineering, like creating endings in engineering, and the play on that word. And I really like the way that, I'm an old typographic geek, and I love the way it sits as well. It's quite a long word and lots of nice shapes in it. Right, what's in the book though? So obviously the first book really sets down the message of why we don't design endings, and the second book is about like, how do we do it? So I wanted to capture in more succinct terms the problems as I see it. So the beginning of the book starts to talk about the 4 key gaps in the consumer ending, and so these are, and I'll quickly go through them here. The first one is that the relationship breaks between the consumer and the provider. So when that happens, then that responsibility disappears as well. that breaking that partnership also breaks the joint responsibility to assets. So these then fall to society. So we're all picking this up as society. When anyone ends a consumer relationship, problems with it, that's as society's problem. The second one is the asset definition is lost of any of the items that we have had a consumer experience with. And that goes for digital and physical products. So that material waste is lost. So when it merges with other bits of material, we chuck it in landfill, for example, no one has a clue what's in that. You'll have to do sort of microscopic surgery to unravel really what's in there. But this also happens with data as well. When you start lingering data and start getting merged and they lose authority from the company that you originally had that relationship with, and the data sold on and sold on and sold on, that also loses that asset definition loss. The third one is actors and actions are nominalized. So at the end of the physical product life, when I chuck something away, the ownership I relinquish in that moment. That moment, in legal terms, it's like almost totally lost in terms of that was mine, now it's everyone else's, society's problem. And that also happens with data in a different way, where as a consumer of data, having data relationships with company, I thought I had this direct relationship with company A, I trusted them. They, however, sold on my relationship to third parties. I've broken my relationship with company A now, and I have this, so I've assumed that relationship's lost, and I assume as myself that my relationship's been anonymized as well. But that isn't the case in that sense. So this becomes a very cloudy sort of relationship the consumer experiences. And the last one, the fourth one, is that routes to neutralizing are blurred. Through the complexity of the materials that we use, how I properly neutralize a particular product. As we went back to plastic bags, really simple product, it would be understandable how to neutralize that for most people. But get to a pen, how do you neutralize a pen in terms of its key components? Super complicated. And then you get up to like digital products, etc. But it also, this is a massive lack of understanding and knowledge in the consumer at the end, and responsibility. So, for example, how I end a digital relationship, I have no idea really what's going on as a regular consumer. So I just stop using it. And similar with the end of product life, that to end of physical materials is blurred, that conclusion. So at the beginning of the book, I wanted to frame those things in a really sort of solid way. So these are the challenges that we're trying to unravel. And then going back to the wider themes of the following parts, the following chapters of the book, it starts to, and I get asked this a lot, what are the arguments to bring up in businesses so I can have a positive discussion with my stakeholders, my colleagues, and arguably the wider business of why we need to design and consider endings. And so I go through a whole chapter and argument about that. Also talk a bit about charities and how emotionally we find it easier to purchase charity than it is to consider offboarding experiences around benevolence. And then, as you would imagine, this stacks about how to build an ending. So we talk about types of endings. There's like 8 types of endings that are common in the consumer experience, and there's different phases that you go through, and each of these phases, from the crack of doubt to the aftermath, has characteristics that you need to think about and design for. And then we talk about how to run an endings project. So there's a return on investment, sort of early versions of how you might assemble a team and what impact it might make on your business. Because if you're building a physical business, if you've got a physical business, then you're thinking about returns, dismantling and stuff like that. Incredibly expensive, real investment. But if you're doing a digital business, actually it's a very little really on the material investment. And in terms of skill set of raising our awareness and starting to design things for customers offboarding, a lot of the same values can be applied to the end of the consumer experience. And then there's lots of tools in there like ends canvas, transaction model tools, and post-service personas, etc., etc. So stacks in the book. And one of the real problems with being an author is cutting stuff out. And so at the moment, I'm pretty much editing down.
Yeah, I know the feeling. When reality is not linear and you have to put it into a linear form, it can be very frustrating.
Totally.
So I have 2 final questions for you. And one is, I want to dig deeper into why you personally are so fascinated with this challenge. I think it's not the only societal tragedy. It's not the only thing that people suffer, and maybe not, if you'd argue that it's the biggest one that most people suffer the most because of this issue relative to other issues. So why are you so interested in it? What drew you to it in that kind of personal connection sense?
So really, when I first started writing the first book, understanding the depth of the problem was super interesting, and understanding its ever such long tentacles into all sorts of aspects of consumerism. And the other thing which helped me, and I think one of the reasons I feel very passionate about it, is that I see it, the same problem across sectors. Now, in my mind, and in many people's minds, privacy and social networks, mis-selling in financial services, and plastics in the sea have no connection. For me, with endings, all the same. And it all comes from a source of failing to design offboarding sequences that capture materials, that conclude a positive experience, collaborative and under control. And what we've created is a society that is consuming at an enormous rate, but is flippant about how the ending happens. So we have chaotic, very irresponsible endings. So when I think about plastics in the sea, I think of shards of broken experiences, not necessarily a material. And because when we reduce something to a material component, then we take the experience and meaning out of it. And that removes the responsibility from the original producer and the original owner, the consumer of that product. And so we need to reattach that back inside the consumer life cycle, because once it's into the waste cycle, then it's society's problem and we cannot get it out of there. So we need to design these things that are inside the consumer life cycle. So that's my passionate plea, is for people to design these things inside the consumer life cycle. And when I get very frustrated when I talk to people about the circular economy, because I hear so much about material aspects, processes in the recycling stream and the provision stream and back-end infrastructure, and I hear so little about the consumer experience of the end. There's very little about that meaning and the importance of that. And I think that same lack of interest makes me see the expiry date on a cookie being 8,000 years, that no one's thinking about the end of the consumer experience, whether it be 8,000 years away or the next 10 minutes.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. This is clearly a really important topic, a really interesting way of looking at things, and a really fun conversation too.
Thanks so much for getting me on the show as well, Aaron. It's been a joy to talk to you, and I've enjoyed talking around the subject area loads and sharing it with you.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.